Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the big issue and representation. Now the big issue is a set text on EDUCAS A-level component 2 paper. It is an optional set text, which means not all schools study it, so please don't panic if your school is not one of them. I do have other videos about Vogue, about Huck, about Women's Realm as well, so please check out my channel if any of those might be more helpful for you. But in this video, I'm going to specifically focus on the representations within the set pages of the Big Issue magazine. Now, in general, across the set pages of the Big Issue, clearly the magazine's own personal ideologies are represented quite clearly. They are obviously going to be representing people who are homeless, people who are in poverty, people who are struggling in a more sympathetic way, because the whole point of the magazine when it was first set up was to offer people who were homeless and who were living in poverty to have a way to make money legally. So it makes sense that the representations are going to be more sympathetic. If you have a look, for example, at the letters page, there is a letter within there that calls vendors and inspiration, you know, talking about them in a really positive light. And you can see that reflected within lots of other pages as well. So, for example, you can see that on the contents page, they talk to a man called Donato, and it's his own personal story. He talks about, you know, I came to London, and giving somebody's own personal story is giving them a chance to explain to the world what their life has been like. And so it constructs this very personalised representation that allows the audience to really see what it must be like to be in that situation. It's giving him a voice where a lot of other mainstream magazines may not give people in that situation a voice to speak out. In fact, the letters page does this again, where it talks about, you know, the vendors going out in all weathers. You know, it's this idea that they're kind of like battling, you know, rain and wind and snow. It makes them feel like heroes. It makes them feel like people who are struggling, but are struggling in a good way. You know, that they are strong and that they're brave and they're overcoming obstacles. It's quite honest though, it's not painting these people as utopian. You know, it does talk about some people, you know, being involved in drugs. And so, you know, it's being reasonably honest. It's not trying to make them look perfect, but it is, you know, discussing the hurdles that they have encountered, but then talking about how they've managed to overcome them. So it's kind of like an underdog success story. There are other incidents where homelessness and homeless people are not represented as these kind of perfect people. You know, they talk about, you know, areas of homelessness being like kind of a Mad Max style environment. And anyone who knows that film is very dystopian, post-apocalyptic, lots of violence and aggression. There are people that talk about being kicked, spat at, threatened because the area was full of homeless people and it being a rough area. So, you know, whilst it is very clearly anti-conservative and pro-supporting people in these situations, they're not idealising homeless people. They are, you know, discussing the problems that they face and the problems that have been created as a result of so much homelessness. So, you know, the representation of homeless people is kind of reasonably balanced. It's obviously sympathetic towards them, but they're not leaving out the kind of more shocking or controversial details and realities of what it is like to be homeless. It's very clear throughout the magazine that the Big Issue has quite left-wing ideologies, and you will find that they represent these left-wing political viewpoints throughout a lot of the pages. There are moments in the set pages where they criticise Margaret Thatcher, talk about the Conservatives closing down libraries, the history of terrible unemployment in the country caused by government laws and legislation. So it seems to be quite clear that the magazine is painting quite a negative picture of Conservative governments. And the implication is that they feel that the Conservative governments are responsible for the amount of homelessness. They even talk about the fact that the Conservatives are planning on holding a memorial for Margaret Thatcher, previous UK Prime Minister. And the suggestion in the letters page is that they take the funding that was going to be used on that memorial and use it instead to build public libraries. And so, you know, clearly demonstrating quite an anti-Thatcher and therefore anti-Conservative ideology. They called Donald Trump garish. so clearly quite negative representations of Trump. And Trump is, don't forget, a Republican, which is kind of the American equivalent of the Conservative Party. So very much making it clear that the magazine and the people that work there are very much more left-wing and anti-right-wing. It's useful as well to have a look at the way gender is represented in the big issue. So if we start by having a look at the representation of men, if you have a look at some of the pages, there's like the Westworld Sky advert. You've got the man on there in his suit, looks very professional, looks very masculine. The spotlight is on him. It makes him look very powerful. That's quite a traditional, stereotypical representation of men. There's an article called Why Don't the Homeless Just Go Home? And they interview a variety of heads of different organisations. It's interesting to note that every single head that they speak to is male, which suggests that men are the ones that get these top jobs in companies, which is perhaps reflective of the wider world in this context that women still aren't often offered those kind of more senior positions within companies. But it certainly seems to suggest that men have a little bit more power and more status in the hierarchy of British business. The A-Team advert as well for the Blu-ray DVD, that is also obviously very male dominated. The cast for the A-Team was obviously primarily male, so that kind of makes sense. There's an article about artists, and all of the artwork they feature is by male artists. So all in all, the magazine is pretty much dominated by men. It could be that the magazine itself, the journalists that are involved in writing the big issue, are predominantly male, so it might reflect that. Might also be reflective of the fact that actually men are the ones more likely to be made homeless or to end up living on the streets. So perhaps contextually it's reflecting their, the typical vendors and, perhaps reflecting that as a wider social context. Showing men in positions of power is not just one article. If you have a look at the article, which is the double-page spread, We've Made History, they interview or they look at the two founders of the big issue, also both male. You get this kind of low-angle shot of them looking up at them, making them look more kind of dominant and powerful. The magazine talks about them being entrepreneurs, and they use the phrases hard-nosed and tough. Quite masculine, aggressive adjectives to describe someone as, and it kind of adds to this stereotype that men are not very emotional people. They're quite detached and quite determined, and they don't put up with any nonsense from people. So kind of quite reflective of typical stereotypes towards masculinity. There are moments where they talk about a man having his face sliced open, like almost ear to ear. In other pages of the magazine, there are pictures of the Terminator. There's pictures of Captain America. There's pictures of Prince Charles. So, men in positions of power and status. And a lot of those men involved in kind of aggression or fighting, which again reflects this idea that men are perhaps, we often see men as represented as being more violent and aggressive in the media. You can see men represented on other pages as well in quite respected and idolised ways. You've got pictures of people like the Dalai Lama with a halo around his head, suggesting that he's somebody that should be worshipped and is holy. You have pictures of Paul Weller, and he's called the Mod Father, so clearly a play on the Godfather, making him seem very important and powerful. Sir Alex Ferguson is referred to as a legend, as is John Lydon, who's a kind of punk musician. So, the use of words that create these representations of men as being powerful and respected. Andy Murray is referred to as a champion. Daniel Radcliffe is referred to as a star. So it's interesting to see these representations of men that clearly kind of hold them up as role models for men and create these representations of men being successful and powerful and dominant within their fields. Whereas Joanna Lumley, who is a very famous actress who's been going for, decades and decades, she's just referred to as an actress. So, she's not referred to as a star or a legend. So it seems that women are just referred to by what their actual job is, whereas the men are referred to in a more respected and idealised way. However, there is also a picture of David Bowie on the pages as well. David Bowie was somebody who challenged those traditional gender representations a lot during his time here on Earth. he was quite well known for his kind of androgynous looks, wearing makeup and not being afraid to experiment with things like clothes, costumes, shoes, makeup, heels. And despite being, on the surface a straight white man, he's very much somebody that didn't really care about gender rules. And so, there are some moments in the magazine that do challenge those typical stereotypes of men and masculinity. One article in particular that might be good to discuss in terms of gender and sexuality would be the Grayson Perry article, the one that says "Letter to My Younger Self." Grayson Perry is quite a kind of bold and creative figure who's never really afraid to challenge those kind of gender boundaries. So you can see photos of him within the article, wearing a dress, heels, makeup and a wig, which is obviously countertypical to the ways that many men are often represented in the media, allowing, him to explore his gender identity. And he actually talks about his experiences. He uses the word transvestite. He talks about his experiences dressing up in more female clothing. So, the article does explore different representations of men that perhaps, you might not necessarily see in many mainstream media products. And that reflects the big issue as being a more alternative magazine. This particular article, despite the fact that he's represented in a dress and wig and heels and makeup, it talks about in his youth him being part of the army cadets. It talks about him enjoying war films and going to college. And so perhaps, some aspects of him represented in a more traditionally masculine way. So it's quite interesting that, the representations are quite complex. It's not just saying he is a more feminine person or he displays more feminine aspects in terms of his gender, because actually it's a bit of a mix. He clearly enjoys dressing up in more feminine clothing, but he has a background that has, more traditionally masculine interests as well. So creating perhaps more complex representations of gender for men. So let's have a look at the representations of women in this magazine as well. There are actually some representations of women that do challenge gender stereotypes quite a lot. There's also pictures and interviews with leaders of modern political groups, so people like Theresa May, Nicola Sturgeon. So we're seeing female leaders in positions that are, the most powerful positions within the United Kingdom. We're seeing Sophie Raworth, who's being interviewed. She's a newsreader. Again, she's kind of worked her way up, very educated. She is a postgraduate student. She's being interviewed about her success and her career as well, and her influence over the big issue. And so, representations of women being quite strong, empowered, educated, and respected for the most part. So the representations of women are quite countertypical. There is the Turn to Us pension page, and that might suggest that women can't cope financially once their male partner has passed away. This idea that you kind of need to have your, the advert is suggesting that, women aren't going to be able to survive without the help of this particular organisation. So that might reflect more traditional stereotypes of women relying on a male partner financially. And obviously, because it is the big issue and they are an alternative magazine and they present themselves as an alternative to the mainstream media, it makes sense that a lot of the representations are quite alternative, whether it is in terms of sexuality or the representations of gender on some pages, and the representations of alternatives to kind of conservative or more right-wing ideologies. They're representing more left-wing ideologies. It makes sense. Their audience is also going to primarily be left-wing, and so it does reflect their target audience, it reflects the company's ideologies, and it reflects the kind of political contexts of the time. So that was my easy to understand guide to representations in the big issue. Don't forget to hit subscribe. I've got lots of other episodes about the big issue, about Huck, Vogue, Woman's Realm, and all the other A-level set texts and theories. And you can also leave comments below if there are any videos that you would like that I don't already have.